guys, TechSir here. In this video, I'm going to clear up some common misconceptions when it comes to aiming with a mouse and keyboard, and give you some actionable steps and advice that you can start applying right away to improve your aim. The first step when it comes to improving your aim on mouse and keyboard is finding a reasonable sensitivity that you're comfortable with using. This is a huge discussion and is a topic worth making an entire separate video on, so I won't go into too much detail as I'll likely be making a video on sensitivity in the future. So make sure to check the description for when that comes out. What I will say about sensitivity is, as long as you're using one under 19 centimeters per 360, you're probably fine. If you're not sure what that means, it'll all make sense after watching my sensitivity video. Most new players when coming to mouse and keyboard have a tendency to play with ridiculously high sensitivity because they think it'll make them flick faster. It's pretty easy to understand why someone would think like this, but this kind of logic doesn't have all the pieces to the puzzle. Having a sensitivity that is too high will dramatically make it harder to be more precise. Low sensitivity, on the other hand, makes precision aiming much easier and naturally increases your smoothness, which is really important when it comes to tracking. But low sensitivity is not without problems either, as having a sensitivity that is too low can be detrimental to your movement, and it starts to introduce issues like not being able to keep up with enemies that are circling around you or ones that get too close. If you're struggling to choose a sensitivity, the truth is, most good aimers have at some point in their careers experimented with multiple sensitivities, and they have a good understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of all of them. So don't be afraid to test out different sensitivities for yourself. You can get good with any reasonable sensitivity. Just remember that no sensitivity is perfect, and you're going to have areas of weaknesses to work on regardless of which route you choose. This is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to sensitivity, but the bottom line is pick one that allows you enough freedom of movement and one that allows you to manipulate your crosshair and find controlled movements. While on the subject of controlled movements, let's talk about wrist movements versus arm movements. There's a common misconception that high sensitivity players use only their wrist and that low sensitivity players use only their arm. While it's true that sensitivity does play a role in how much arm or wrist someone uses, good aimers actually use a combination. The only thing that sensitivity changes is the ratio of how much arm or wrist they're using. It doesn't completely eliminate the need to use one or the other. Actually, the opposite is true. When using low sense, for example, the wrist suddenly becomes very important at times when your range of motion is limited. Let's say you do a 180 and nearly run out of mousepad space, but your crosshair is still not quite on your enemy. You don't have enough time to recenter your hand in the middle of your mousepad and do another swipe, because that'll give your opponent too much time to react. So, what do you do instead? You turn your mouse a few extra degrees with your wrist to close the distance. As you can see, in a situation like this, even a so-called arm aimer relies on their wrist a lot. Wrist aimers, on the other hand, may not have as many issues when running out of mousepad space, but there's still a lot of situations when they do use their arm. Not only is the arm helpful for times when your wrist reaches its max range of motion, but it's also very important for smoothness, especially when dealing with tracking aim, or tracing aim as I've heard some people call it, which is when you continuously follow your target with your crosshair and shoot the whole way through, rather than just flicking to your target once and clicking. Don't handicap yourself in either of these aiming styles just because you're an arm aimer or a wrist aimer. You need to learn how to control both to truly get good. In fact, aiming goes beyond these two parts of the body. The fingers, the elbow, the chest, and even shoulder can also play a role in the way you aim. And even though those areas don't get talked about much in this conversation, make no mistake, these small nuances in the way that you aim will make a huge difference. But most of this will come naturally the more experience you gain when practicing. Speaking of practice, one of the most beneficial things to do when practicing your aim is to practice keeping your hand relaxed. During intense moments, it becomes very natural to tense up your wrist or squeeze your mouse without even thinking about it. These subconscious actions can not only cause you to injure yourself if you're not careful, but will also reduce your range of motion when doing them, which doesn't quite work in your favor either, especially when trying to keep up with a fast-moving target. Another good thing to do when training your aim is to practice patience. Believe it or not, a lot of aiming is actually just being patient and shooting at the right times. As I demonstrate later in the video, patience is not something that should be overlooked when aim training, but I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the best tools that I found to put these concepts to practice is a Steam game called Kovvaks FPS Aim Trainer. It's currently $10 on Steam, and I couldn't recommend it enough for someone looking to improve their aim. It lets you put in your game settings like sensitivity and field of view, and recreate virtually any situation you can come up with, making it extremely useful to work on your weaknesses. If you know that you struggle with tracking at close range, for example, or maybe you have a hard time aiming upward, this game has a ton of scenarios to help you practice those specifically. The maps are workshop-based, which means people are constantly coming out with new ones. I currently have about 300 hours logged into the game, and I can personally say this tool has helped me a lot. If you don't want to spend the money, there are other free alternatives out there, one of the best being a browser-based one called aiming.pro. I'll make sure to put a link to that in the description. But if you're looking for the best of the best, I still recommend Kovvaks for the time being. One thing to remember is, just like every tool, it's only as effective as the person using it. Because there are so many people playing and making maps for this game, inevitably, there are a lot of not so useful maps. When loading into the sandbox mode, you'll be greeted with a list of the most popular maps from the Steam Workshop. It's important to note that some of these, while they may be fun like Tile Frenzy, won't do much in terms of actually helping you improve inside of actual games. The good news is, the more time you spend playing, the more useful maps you'll find. You can save maps by favoring them by clicking on the star next to the name, as well as downloading local copies to your hard drive by clicking the download button to the right of the scenario name. Some of my personal favorites are called Bounce 180, One Wall 6 Target Small, Tile Frenzy 180, Close Longs Trace, and Mid-Range Smoothness Training. And that's just a few. There are many more great maps for practicing your aim, and there are several Discord servers that can help you find scenarios to help you with your specific weaknesses. I'll have some linked in the description of this video. Here's a couple example clips of some of the scenarios you can play in the same trainer. This is a good time to show you what I was talking about earlier when I said a lot of aim is patience. I'm on the map called One Wall 6 Targets, and the reason this is a good map to showcase what I meant earlier is because most people when playing this map for the first time will try to flick as fast as they possibly can and only rely on their muscle memory. As soon as I start to speed up, you might be able to notice that I'm just barely clicking too soon. This is exaggerated for emphasis, but this is exactly what happens when you try to aim like this, because you're attempting to only use your muscle memory rather than taking your time to actively aim and then confirm you're actually on the target. If you do decide to get Kovvaks, or you already have it, I want you to do an experiment. If you opted into using aiming.pro, you can use a map called Target Frenzy to follow along instead. Play this map one time with your regular sense, not worrying about your score at all. Only focus on casually clicking the red dots when you're 100% certain that your crosshair is directly on top of the target. Now, play the map a second time, but this time raise your sensitivity to something higher that you normally don't play on, and try to go relatively fast. I bet you'll notice that you're often clicking around the edges of the target, or missing outright altogether. Most people blame the fact that you're using a high sense, or that you're trying to go too fast, which to be fair is partly correct, but I'll get to that in a moment. But the thing is, the changes aren't the problem, they merely expose the problem. The problem is that you're not focusing enough attention on whether you're actually on the target before clicking. This problem translates very heavily into actual games too, and now that I've pointed it out, you should start to recognize it the next few times it happens to you in game. It's especially noticeable in games with very low time to kill, like Counter-Strike for example. If you've ever played Counter-Strike before, think of how many times on pistol rounds you've done this. It's extremely easy in the heat of the moment to flick on an enemy that suddenly appears in front of you, only to shoot and miss, causing you to suddenly die without knowing whether or not you actually were on his head at the time of firing. In other words, you just flicked wildly assuming that you were going to hit, regardless of knowing whether or not he was in your crosshair. This brings up the next concern. If going too fast causes you to miss, then how can you become quick enough to still react? The thing to remember is that going fast in and of itself is not the problem. The problem is not taking enough time to confirm your crosshair placement before clicking. The ideal situation would be you flick near your target as fast as you possibly can, make the micro correction, spend a fraction of a second to confirm that the target is indeed in your crosshair, and if it's not, you make another micro correction. Then, and only then, do you proceed to fire. Try doing this technique when practicing your aim until it becomes second nature. And once it does, it should start to feel like one fluid motion. This is where the speed comes in. If you want to get faster, you should get faster at the whole process, instead of just moving your arm or wrist faster. Because hopefully by now you've realized that moving your arm or wrist faster doesn't necessarily translate into killing faster. Last but not least, let's talk about improving at tracking. Most of the things I mentioned throughout this video still apply to tracking. Tracking, explained very simply, is flicking onto your target, continuously shooting while following their movements with your crosshair, and then flicking back onto the target when they escape your crosshair. And you just repeat this process. The three things that have helped me the most when tracking has been, number 1, as I've mentioned before, learning not to tense up my hands or squeeze the mouse too hard. Number 2, learning to use my arm and assisting with keeping my tracking movement smooth. And number 3, learning to focus on reacting to the target rather than focusing on what my hand is doing. Or as others like to say, don't think, just react. Getting good at tracking at the end of the day is ultimately putting in the repetitions to get comfortable with moving your mouse around. The more familiar you become with how these movements feel, and the more smooth you can get, the better your tracking will become. Keeping this in mind and using the 3 tips I gave should help you in practicing. Aim trainers again can be very useful as well. To conclude, you should find a sensitivity that fits your needs for the game you're playing, which allows you enough freedom of movement, but isn't too difficult to aim precisely with. Both your arm and wrist is beneficial regardless of whatever sensitivity you choose. During intense moments, try to remember not to tense up or squeeze your mouse too hard because it reduces your range of motion and can potentially cause injury. Muscle memory is important, but you shouldn't rely on it completely. Rather, focus on actively aiming your shots. And lastly, tools like Kovvaks FPS Aim Trainer are only as good as the one using them. I personally recommend the program, and playing between 20 minutes to an hour a day can greatly improve your aim. However, try to be picky with your time and find the maps that actually help you. As I mentioned earlier, I'll have links in the description to some Discord channels that can help you filter out the useful maps. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video helpful in some way. If you did, feel free to hit the like button, consider subscribing for more content like this, as well as other videos on my channel, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments.